The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, a former Ontario cabinet minister and senator looks back at a life in politics. Then, with the U.S. election only weeks away, what role, if any, could artificial intelligence play in determining the outcome? That's next on The Agenda. She got appointed to the Ontario cabinet at the tender age of 36, and ever since, Frances Lankin has been trying to make a difference both inside and adjacent to politics. She started her political life as a New Democrat MPP, but was appointed by Stephen Harper to do intelligence review, and then by Justin Trudeau to be a senator. Now, 5 years before she had to, Lankin today retires from the Senate. So we thought we'd get her into this studio to find out why. Welcome back, Frances Lankin.
Thank you very much.
Let's start there. No one leaves this job early, but apparently you're leaving 5 years early. How come?
I am, because I think I have another chapter left in me, and I don't know what it is. And I really came to the conclusion that I have to close one chapter before I can start to write the next, and it seemed like the right time for me.
The Senate, I don't have to tell you, for only about 157 years has been, I guess, the most maligned legislative body in the country. Now that you've been there for a while, from your vantage point, does it deserve to be?
No. Things have happened that deserve to be criticized. The institution has grown in a direction, like politics in general, being more divisive, and it has, I think, in the time I've been there, has played a lot to the repeating the speaking lines from the other place, which I think is of very little value to Canadians. But the reform movement that has been going on, the move to a less partisan, a more independent Senate, I think is critical. And I think the incredible talent that's in that institution brings really important, diverse thinking to the review of legislation.
Let me follow up on that, because obviously Justin Trudeau brought in a new way of doing the Senate. He wasn't just going to appoint the chief fundraiser for the Liberals, as had often been the case in the past. You're supposed to be acting, I guess, more like a council of elders as opposed to a very partisan carbon copy of the House of Commons. Again, with the benefit of the hindsight you now have, has that in fact happened?
We've moved a distance towards it, but there's more to go. I think it's important to, for me at least, I mean, everyone has perhaps a different opinion. I think you can't divorce the Senate from its role as part of the two chambers of Parliament. And so there is a connection, and should be a connection, to the democratically elected accountable chamber, the House of Commons. But the role is different, and I think as it was set out in the Supreme Court decision, it really is to review government legislation, review what comes from the House of Commons with a view to ensuring that it's constitutionally compliant, charter compliant, that we understand the regional impacts, the impacts on Indigenous peoples and other minority populations. And sometimes just fix bad legislative writing. I mean, there are errors that come through as well. So there's a breadth to it. But the other part of the role, the studies that are done by committees, can be far-reaching and can set a legislative agenda that we see come into being many years later. So, medical assistance in dying is a really good example.
That was a big one.
Yeah.
The critics would say those kinds of important debates that the Senate takes part in and helps kind of shape future policy for the entire country are few and far between. And conservatives in particular say, the Prime Minister hasn't appointed quote-unquote card-carrying partisan Liberals, but most of them are sort of progressive and from his side of the political spectrum anyway. So is it all that different? What's your take?
Well, I think that's a legitimate concern to put forward, and I think that over the years that I was there were a lot of center-left appointments that were made, but notable others as well. I mean, my friend Charles Adler doesn't fit into that center.
No, he does not.
He does not. So I think that there has been a mix, and I think remembering that when I was appointed, I was one of the first independents appointed, the group of seven. The chamber was largely composed of members of the Conservative caucus. So there was a balancing that was done. I think that very few parliamentarians like myself were appointed. Now you see some more of that because there are some skill sets and some knowledge and some understanding of the workings that it's helpful to have that diverse view at the table as well. So I think it's headed in the right direction, but it's a work in progress.
Well, Pierre Poilievre says if he wins the next election, he's going to go back to having the Senate and senators be appointed the way they were, which is basically whoever the prime minister wants, and if they're partisan conservatives, that's fine. If that happens, what do you think will be lost?
I believe the opportunity to enhance the value of that chamber to Canadians, to have a group of people that are not subject to and loyal to a party first, but are looking at the large picture. And all politicians should be doing that, but quite frankly, you take a look at what goes on in the House of Commons now. That's not the game that's being played, not just in the House of Commons, writ large political divisiveness, not just in this country. There's another whole force at work, and it's a pendulum. It will swing back. I fear it will get worse before it swings back. And I think the Senate in Canada is a check against that, and that will be lost. But it will take some time because although there are a number of senators who will retire over the next couple of years, it will take a few years before the numbers that perhaps Pierre Poilievre, if he's elected, would like to see would be reached.
Conservatives are quite outnumbered right now.
Yes, they are.
But they may not be, obviously, if he wins. You're there almost 9 years, right, in the Senate?
Yeah.
What do you think the most useful thing for Canadians you were associated with? What happened?
Well, wow, there's so many things. I mentioned medical assistance in dying, so I guess that's just in my head right now, having said that. That is difficult legislation. It's difficult public policy. There are intricacies to it and there are impacts from it, and I don't believe we've got it absolutely right yet. It will evolve, and that's part of the process of building laws and ensuring that the laws are meeting the needs of Canadians. You have to learn as you go along. You have to do developmental evaluation and be willing to course correct. So, I think that was a pretty spectacular piece of work. I think that personally, I've had the opportunity also to look at the national security and intelligence side of things, and I think that some of the reports, and the most recent report on foreign interference from that committee, has spurred a greater transparency and openness and probing, and Canadians are much more aware. Witness, as we've seen, the revelations of the RCMP investigation with respect to Indian government officials directing work here in Canada that has led to even as much as murder of people. These are serious issues, and the Senate Committee on Security is gripped with these. And I think that one of the advantages is when you don't have to play it out, for the sake of the camera and the social media clips and the partisan rah-rah. I think people settle into really trying to understand and to come to collective decisions that are influenced by a lot of opinions. And that, to me, is always better than, the majority wins. You've got to have that breadth of consideration of ideas to really come to good conclusions about our country.
I wouldn't necessarily put this at the top of your list, but you were part of a group that got the words of the national anthem changed as well.
Yeah.
It's not all our sons command anymore.
No, it's
all thy
not.
sons command.
No, it is in all of us command. And I just want to say, in the chamber, when they did the retirement tributes, there were a lot of people spoke about O Canada, and I might have got it over the finish line, but many senators, there's over 30 years of attempts to change those two words. And in particular, I want to pay tribute to Senator Nancy Ruth. She did the long haul work on it, and when she reached 75, and that was her retirement date, she passed it to me, and it was an honor, and it was fun. And I knew enough about the rules to sit and wait for my time to do it, and sprung it and got it done. And I'm happy because I have 5 great-granddaughters, and they are growing up now learning words that don't exclude them. And when I saw the National Women's Hockey Team, win, and the anthem was played, and I saw first of all, the absolute joy in their eyes, but I heard the words too. It meant a lot to me for years of working on gender discrimination and the elimination of such. It was important, and I feel good about that.
Good. This is a bit of an exit interview because you've been in public life for quite a long time. So I don't just want to talk about your time at the Senate. I want to go back. I want to go back 34 years because, as I said off the top, you were in the cabinet of the government of Ontario at the age of 36. And while I'm tempted to ask you whether your time as a childcare worker or jail guard prepared you for politics, that's too easy. I do want to ask, 36 is pretty young to have that much responsibility. Did you feel you were, I mean, let's face it, no one thought Bob Rae's government was going to win that election in 1990. We'd never had an NDP government before. Did you think you were ready for it?
I don't think anyone is ever absolutely ready to step into something brand new, but was I up for it? Absolutely. Was I gung-ho about it? Was I passionate? I think I had that youthful exuberance that helped bring a dedication and a drive to the work that I did. And so I didn't feel like, oh, I'm too young for this. That never crossed my mind. I just felt like I've got a lot to learn, so let's get to the books.
You were in the studio almost a decade ago on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the swearing in of that government. And here's what you had to say about that day then. Sheldon, if you would.
I was shaking. I was delirious with joy. I was looking forward with great anticipation to, all that was to happen and all the wonderful things we were going to be able to accomplish finally, after years of pounding the table. We were going to be able to do these things that meant so much to us and I felt so passionate about in terms of building a better and more equal Ontario.
As you look back at those years, what's the thing you got done that you're most proud of?
You always want to bring it down to one thing. I am incredibly proud of our government's response after the bombing of the Morgentaler Clinic. I had fought for years for the rights of women to control their own bodies and to make their choices. And as Minister of Health, along with the late Marion Boyd, who was the Attorney General at the time, both of us strong feminists, we came to Cabinet with a proposal of how we were going to protect women seeking access to a legal health service, how we were going to protect the healthcare providers that
Just
were being...
For the young people watching this who will not remember any of this, this was an abortion clinic, a freestanding abortion clinic on Harbord Street in downtown Toronto, which was bombed, firebombed one day.
Yeah, and there were death threats against physicians in their homes, and it was happening in the States. There were, gunshots at doctors' homes in the States. It was overflowing here in Canada. I'm really very proud of that work. I'm very proud of the work that I was able to be part of in economic development and trade, where we looked at the big picture and we dealt with all the big companies.
You were the minister.
In terms of investments and jobs, but we also really looked at community and community economic development. That's where my heart and soul's always been, at community. And we got to do some really interesting work there. Labor legislation didn't survive. It got repealed by the next government. But, there are bookends in life, and the Rae government passed anti-scab legislation, so anti-replacement worker legislation. And I just had the opportunity a couple months ago to be the sponsor for the government legislation in the Senate that banned replacement workers in federally regulated corporations. So, it begins and it ends, and the circle continues.
You know what was interesting about that answer?
Yeah.
The cabinet minister called it anti-scab legislation, but the former senator says, well, wait a second, I have to be a little less partisan in my dialogue, so let's just call it anti-replacement worker legislation.
Well, I thought about you just saying that no one will know what I'm talking about when I said the Morgentaler Clinic, and I thought, anti-scab is a bit of a lingo, and I thought it wasn't just being a senator.
Okay.
I thought I would just be more explanatory.
Gotcha. You guys obviously took over in the teeth of the worst recession since the Great Depression, and there was a lot of stuff you wanted to do that you couldn't get done because of the economic reality at the time. Like what? What do you regret that you didn't get done?
Auto insurance.
Public insurance.
Public insurance. It felt to me that was a true pocketbook issue, and one that people understood, and one that was an important aspect of people's lives. And honestly, I'm one of the ministers who came to the conclusion that we couldn't proceed with it. And I looked at all of the head offices that would be rightly so amalgamated. That was the whole plan, to bring the costs down of administration. But all of the women clerical and secretarial workers, largely women and lower paid, and in the middle of a recession, they would be put out of work, and I could not bring myself to support that. I still think it's a good public policy, but I couldn't support it at that time. That's an example.
The most, if I may say, the most controversial thing you guys did as a government back in the day were the so-called Ray Days. This was the social contract, the idea being to give, and we were affected by it here at TVO, obviously, you give people some unpaid days off, and that way you obviate the need to fire 20,000 people in order to save a couple of $1 billion in public expenditures. It also, I mean, the fact is you had to unilaterally abrogate collectively bargained agreements, which for a party of labor is a very tough thing to do. Again, let's go back almost a decade to the 25th anniversary of the Ray government. Here's what you said in this studio about that then. Sheldon, if you would.
I left the chamber and cried after that vote. I'm a trade unionist, and I really believe in the importance of living up to the contract, the collective agreement. It's you can't just do that by legislation. We did, and it was soul destroying for many of us. The intent behind it was absolutely the right thing and absolutely saved thousands and thousands of jobs. And so it was just a horrendous experience to go through.
With the benefit of an additional decade of hindsight, do you think there was any better or different way to achieve the savings that you needed to achieve than that?
I still think it was the wrong thing to do. And I think when the collective agreement came open, it could have been more vigorously bargained at the table, and that there were routes to go. I do remember the arguments and understand that if we were not to do something, that it would flow down to municipalities to make those decisions. And in many communities, the political circumstances would mean cutting of services that we also cherished and wanted to see. So things aren't always easy choices, but I believe opening up collective agreements was a mistake. Bob Ray and I were talking about that last week. It still comes back to haunt us in conversations. And I still believe that it was a mistake. But, here we are, and life goes on. And
as you talked about it last week, did you convince him of the wrongness of his ways back then?
I'm not going to tell you what he said to me. You can ask him sometime.
Okay, I will do that. I will do that. Well, after the aforementioned Mr. Ray stepped down as the leader of your party, defeated first in the 1995 election, then a year later stepped down as leader of the party, you ran to replace him.
I did.
And you came second.
I did.
Howard Hampton won.
Yes.
Do you ever wonder how things might have been different for you personally, for your party, for the province, had you, instead of Howard, won that convention?
Not really. I don't reflect on it that way, because I don't want to seem overly modest, but I don't put myself at the center of these things. There were ideas that we were all fighting for. The party, I believe, needed a break from the direction that many people felt Bob took us, that they disagreed with, and I was very closely aligned with Bob's leadership. I'm part of what they call the inner circle, and so I understand how that went down. I also think that I personally hold a little bit of ambivalence about stepping into the center of leadership, and there was almost, I don't think this is revisionist, it was almost a sense of relief. And I think part of my performance in the leadership campaign was affected by that little bit of ambivalence that I had about it. It was almost like it was something that was expected of me to do, and I did it, and I don't know that I ever committed myself fully enough, and maybe that's why I didn't win.
Okay, let's come back to present day.
Yeah.
You had a nice day the other day in the Senate. A lot of people stood up and gave very lovely speeches about you. And I want to play a clip here. This is Robert Black, your Senate colleague, quoting your former NDP cabinet colleague, Elmer Buchanan, about you back in the day. Sheldon, if you would.
Having been a former guard in the infamous Don Jail in Toronto, Frances was a tough, fearless chair who, when she thought she was on the correct side of a discussion, she did not back down. not even for Premier Ray. Elmer also noted that if my remarks were to be made in a less formal setting, he would have suggested much more colorful language.
Well, that raises a bunch of questions. Did you swear a lot at the cabinet table?
I don't think I did, but I want to know from Elmer. I'm going to get a hold of him to find out exactly what he meant. Outside of the cabinet table, yeah. Do I still? Yeah.
Maybe just a little bit.
Just a little bit. Yeah.
How was that day?
Oh, it's like any of these big days, swearing in or whatever. It's sort of like a blur. I haven't had a chance to go back and look at it in detail yet, but there were lovely things that were said, and I got to put out a few things that I cared deeply about. You know, say thank you to a lot of people, but put out a couple of things and make the points that I wanted to make on my way out.
I've got a clip of one of them. Okay. I want to play this now because I thought, certainly the part of your speech that really grabbed me was your concern about the normalization of the spewing of hate, as you called it, in our politics today, highlighted by the trucker convoy that you were able to see out your window from your Parliament Hill office. Okay, here's what you had to say about that. Sheldon, the clip, please.
And then I looked, and hanging on the fence, once again, above the Canadian flag, was a Trump banner. I looked back down to the Canadian flag, you know, I was insulted by this, and then I saw that every one of those Canadian flags was hung upside down. I have to tell you, I mean, I was disgusted. I was incensed. I was moved almost to intemperate behavior. Screaming at them, calling them traitors, calling them criminals. There's no place in peaceful debate for that kind of behavior. There is no place for treating servants of Canada, whether they're elected, whether they are working in staff positions, whether they're support staff within the building.
Our politics seem to be inexorably getting more toxic, and I wonder if you believe that it's inevitable that that will continue.
In the short term, yes. We're on a path, and I do not see any of the key leadership figures that need to speak out, whether they're in politics or they're in the corporate boardrooms or they're in union halls or they're in community organizations. I don't see a groundswell of voices saying, enough already, stop this. This is dangerous, it's inciting violence. You know, and I mean, I know we all know from the news that there are both domestic and foreign influences that are fomenting this. But political leaders have a stage. They're given a stage. It's a position of privilege. They have a responsibility and duty, and many of them are failing badly right now and are part of the problem. And I'm angry about it. I mean, I could hear in my voice when I was talking about that. I just believe that this country is so amazing and so wonderful, and that good people with good hearts have to stand up and have to unite and join hands and insist that political leaders stop and do what's best for Canadians, not what's best for them and their political fortunes.
The monetizing of misery it feels inexorable right now. Mm-hmm. You know, people make peacock speeches in Parliament, and then they clip it, they put it on their websites, and they fundraise off it. And the more egregious it is, the more money they seem to bring in. How is that cycle broken?
Well, you know, most of that I see through the eyes of the Senate, and it's broken by this project and moving forward on the independence project, because most of the speeches or questions asked by my good friend, the leader of the Conservative caucus in the Senate, are designed entirely to clip and put on social media. You know, I'm feeling old. You know, when I was young and my parents rejected something of the younger generation, I just think that we have not found a way to harness the positive power of social media. I thought at the beginning we were, but I think it has become the center of toxicity and promoting toxicity. And that, I don't know, that goal of getting the clip and being the next viral, outrageous statement out there has overtaken people. I I don't know. I guess I'm just getting old. I don't understand where the goodness in the hearts are, and where people can't reach out to find a way forward that encompasses a lot of different views and not just insist on their own view as being right.
Last question. You may say you feel old, but you're only 70 years young. So you got at least one more act in life.
Yeah.
You got any ideas about what that's going to be?
I don't. I've said this, so people have heard this. I have been trying for the last couple of years, since my husband passed, I've been trying to figure out what does, the next chapter look like. And every time I go back to Ottawa, I get, into another project and I'm gung-ho to, do this or do that. And I haven't been able to reflect and to really know what it looks like. So I need to close the one chapter before I can write the next. But I do know it won't be sitting home cocooning. I'll do a little bit of that. I'm tired. I'll do a little bit of that. But I will look for places to continue to have an impact and to more and more, work to support young people whose voices I think are a positive feature of our communities and help them grow and help them have the impact.
That is the Frances Lankin your late husband Wayne knew and loved so much.
Thank you.
The woman who still wants to make an impact. That's Frances Lankin. Her last day in the Senate was today. Thanks for joining us here at TVO.
Thank you for all the years, Steve. Thank you.
American politics hardly needed something new to rattle it, but the advent of artificial intelligence promises or maybe threatens to do just that in an already tumultuous election year. Corey Alpert is a founding partner of South and West, an American political consulting firm, and he is now pursuing a PhD at the University of Melbourne, researching the implications of artificial intelligence for democracy. And he joins us now here in our studio. It's great to meet you. Thanks for coming in.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
I left out a bunch of stuff in the intro, which I'm going to add right now. For example, you're 29 years old.
Correct.
But already you worked on Pete Buttigieg's attempt to become the Democratic presidential nominee. You've worked for Kamala Harris. Mm-hmm. You were, quote unquote, advance lead in the White House. Mm-hmm. In the Biden administration.
Yep.
So the first question is, what's an advance lead?
So the advance team in the White House, we travel around the country and travel around the world helping set up events and public engagements for the president, the vice president, and their spouses. So from the beginning of the Biden administration until the end of December last year, I helped all four of those principals travel around and communicate the message of the Biden-Harris administration around the United States and around the world.
So you know Kamala Harris pretty well.
I've gotten to spend a lot of time around her and her team, absolutely.
The Kamala Harris that you deal with behind the scenes off camera and the Kamala Harris we see on the hustings and on the Stephen Colbert Show and on 60 Minutes and all of that, how different are those two people?
I think they're pretty similar. Now that said, my engagement is really on the logistics end, but she's warm, she's funny, she'll always crack a joke with us behind the scenes, and she's really, really smart. That her prosecutorial history comes out and it's really engaging and it keeps you on your toes in the best possible way. You know that she wants to make sure that the best information's out there.
This is where I push back and say, yeah, but she went through staff like through a goose the first couple of years and was reputed to have a terrible temper. Mm-hmm. So is she really the same person we see on the air compared to behind the scenes?
So look, I did not spend a whole lot of time in closed rooms. I worked on a team that was sort of separated out and helped support her as well as her husband, as well as the president and the first lady. But look, I think the beginning of the administration is tough for any new administration. And I think that a lot of the rumors and content about the vice president were tricky conversations and ones that are deeply rooted in an understanding of what a vice president is supposed to be. And here, just to put a fine point on it, I think that a lot of the commentary was sexist and sort of misaligned to who she is as a person. Now, that said, I think that having been there, I think the first about year and a half, I don't think the staff understood the leadership that she was trying to provide. And I think she also had a big learning curve. being the vice president means you have a staff of several hundred, and it means you have conflicting priorities that are happening all over the country. And I think that there was a huge learning curve that it seems like in the last year or so, things have really improved. But I think the first year or so, I think it was about equal measure. Folks on the inside not really understanding how to communicate with one another.
Well, let me get your view on this, because the Democratic Party did something astonishing that I think nobody's ever seen happen before, which is, the guy who's got the job made a pretty radical decision not to seek re-election, and rather than go through some primary process, they just installed the Veep and that was it. Do you think something was missed? Something that might have been helpful to the Democratic Party by not having a process by which to pick Joe Biden's presidential nomination successor?
So yes, but to take one step back before then, there are some logistics here in that the Biden campaign, what was the Biden campaign, could only ever send the money in the logistical operation to Kamala Harris. So at a certain point, had the party gone with anyone other than Kamala Harris, that's hundreds of millions of dollars, and
that what you'd have to return?
Very likely. I'm not a lawyer, not an expert on the legal side of that, but no other candidate would be able to pick up that campaign apparatus in the way that Kamala Harris did. When she began her campaign, she began with hundreds of field offices across the country, a headquarters staff of hundreds. No other candidate would have been able to do that.
So there's a practicality to having her take over.
There is, but to your question more specifically, I do think there's a huge value in having candidates articulate their case to the Democratic electorate. I voted for Joe Biden in the South Carolina primary, which was first in the nation this year. That said, in the condensed time frame, I don't know that we would have gotten a lot, but I do think that we did lose out a bit on not having some kind of competitive system. That said, I think that Kamala Harris had about the best campaign rollout anyone could ever have had in those first couple of days.
The one thing people ask me when I'm out there talking politics with people, more than any other thing, is, okay, she was vice president for 3.5 years. Tell me one thing she accomplished. Mm-hmm. And okay, so I'll put that question on their behalf to you right now.
Sure.
Never mind that she's not Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. That might be a good reason to vote for her. She's
Sure.
not Donald Trump. But what's she done on the positive side of the ledger that would give people confidence to say, okay, I think she can do this bigger job?
Sure. So on the one hand, to temper that expectation, the vice president has no assigned responsibility in the Constitution or law, other than, I believe there's a law that assigns her to be the chair of the National Space Council.
Well, and she's got to break ties in the Senate.
Correct. So other than that, it's a blank slate. Yeah. I think a lot of you've seen her go out and do a lot on voting rights, on the border, and I think that there's been, to be honest, some mixed results. And I think that she's been put in a tough position, as every vice president is, of being the face of an administration without any real authority. That said, I think you've seen her lead on things like capping insulin prices for Americans to $35 a month. I think you've seen her lead on the fight on abortion rights, and I think she's been a key voice in bringing together coalitions. And I think most of what she's done as a leader is bringing together those coalitions, like you've seen in the 8 states that have passed abortion rights referendums. She's, I think, been a leader in building those coalitions in a way that only someone of a historic nature can do.
If there's one thing both the parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, seem to have in common, it's that they both believe that if the other guy wins, it's going to be an existential crisis for democracy. Do you think American voters see it that way?
I don't think so. I don't think the average voter sees it that way. Now, look, democracy is, I believe, the third most important issue in this election, behind immigration and the economy in some order there. But that said, I think the hyperpartisans, probably myself among them, do see one candidate or the other as a kind of existential threat to American democracy. I think the average American voter isn't as clued into that. They look and they see two very different futures for the country, but I don't think they see it necessarily as an existential threat one side or the other.
Well, put it. I've always believed, and tell me I'm wrong, I've been doing this a little while, but tell me I'm wrong. I've always believed most people, doesn't matter if you're here in the province of Ontario or the United States of America, are pretty moderate, pragmatic people who hang around the middle, and you've got a group of sort of smaller extremists on either end of the political continuum who watch a lot of cable TV and spend too much time on social media and make things crazy for the rest of us. Does that sort of align with what you think's going on?
I think that's absolutely right. And I think that that's what you're seeing in the campaign right now. You have both candidates trying to tack towards the middle. You're seeing Donald Trump soften his position sort of via J.D. Vance on abortion rights. You're seeing Kamala Harris modify and change some of her positions, especially on foreign policy.
And guns.
I think that was a very clear example in that interview recently. So I think that's right. I think the vast majority of the American electorate, as within most Western countries, is somewhere in the middle. But I think they're easily swayed to either side based on the mood of the country.
Right. Let's do we got some numbers here. Yes, your country is polarized, but there does appear to be some common ground held on the issue of artificial intelligence. So here's the Pew Research Center in a survey from September of this year. Almost the same percentage of Republicans as Democrats say AI will be used mostly for bad during the 2024 presidential campaign. And similarly, more than half of those surveyed in both parties say they are extremely or very concerned about AI's influence on the election. Have we finally hit on a bipartisan issue here?
I think we have. But I think the thing that I'm always interested in polls like that is, what do people mean by AI? This is a question that I get asked quite a lot, and I think this is a question most people interested in the topic of AI get asked is, what do we mean by AI? It's a huge swath of technology that can range from your Netflix suggestions all the way to things like the generative AI you see in ChatGPT. So, but I do think it's right, and I agree with that percentage of Americans that I am nervous about the impact that AI is having, both in terms of its capacity to create misinformation. I think we've seen, I think the most famous example would be the AI-generated images that Donald Trump made of Taylor Swift, which she even said directly caused her to then endorse Kamala Harris. But the thing I'm most interested in, and I think the thing that has the biggest impact in the U.S. election and elections broadly around the world, are these algorithms that are putting very polarizing information in front of people, and information that may or may not be true. And I think the impact of that right now is being felt, especially in the South in the United States, where people are being fed all kinds of information about the hurricanes, and that is going to end up costing people's lives when they don't evacuate or when they believe lies like this idea that somehow governments can control hurricanes, which just isn't true. But it's driving this anger and this fear, and I think that's the thing that worries me the most with those algorithms.
The thing, I must confess, I try to keep off a lot of this stuff because it's better for my mental health if I don't spend 20 hours a day on that. But if you're running for office and they are somehow so skilled at being able to create a clip of you saying something that you didn't say, but nobody who's looking at it knows that, I mean, that is just, the potential is rife for mischief there. What do we do about that?
So there are lots of questions on regulation here, and I'll touch on that in a second, but I think this misinformation isn't so much a technical problem as a human problem. This problem of videos and images and text being false, that's not new. That's happened since the Romans, where a fake speech gets published or fake audio comes out. In the age of radio, there were people who could impersonate politicians and go on the radio and broadcast something that someone never said.
It's on steroids now, though.
It absolutely is on steroids. So both the distribution and its ability to be created. So we've lowered the bar for people to be able to create this kind of misinformation, and we've made it a lot easier for it to be distributed and for it to be shared quite frequently. But it's also, I think there's a huge media literacy problem of, you see videos of Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris saying things, and if you're reasonable followers of American politics, that's absolutely not something they would have said.
So you mean the Pope did not endorse Donald Trump for president 8 years ago?
Exactly.
Which I read online?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm sure Donald Trump shared that on Twitter or X. But there's a huge media literacy problem that can help head that off. But absolutely, the ability on both the supply and the demand side for this misinformation is massive.
Meta says, the old Facebook people, they say giving people the power to build community and bring the world closer together is their mission. Are they doing that?
Yes and no. An interesting thing on Meta, they recently rebranded themselves, and I think Mark Zuckerberg said that they're now an AI company. They're no longer a social media company, they are an AI company. I think in some ways they absolutely are. The question is what direction is that happening in? Certainly people are coming together on Facebook, on Instagram, and on WhatsApp, on all of their platforms. They're coming together. I think that is undeniably true. The question is, are they coming together with a basis of fact and with a basis of constructive political conversation? And I think that answer is probably not. And I think we're seeing evidence of that continually, and I think we're going to see more of that as we get closer to this election.
Is that how most people experience artificial intelligence as it relates to this campaign?
That's a great question. I think the way that most people are actually experiencing AI as it comes to this election or any election is through those algorithms, is through, they go on Facebook, they go on X, they go on Instagram, and they're not seeing information that their friends have shared. They're seeing a sort of curated version of what an algorithm thinks that they should see. And I think that in itself is a really, really difficult position to be, because I think that we haven't quite caught up with how that all works. And it's a fundamentally alienating experience for people to go on these social media platforms and then not feel like they're in control of the information they're receiving and not know why they're receiving the information that they're getting. And then their views are shifting because of that. And I think that's how most people are experiencing this.
Now that Elon Musk has gone full mega and he owns X, do we expect X to be sort of in the tank for Donald, I guess?
We're already seeing that. You're seeing a tenfold rise in right-wing content being shown to people on X. Elon recently had a new rule where even if you block someone, you're still going to see their posts. And I think largely that was because he is actually the most blocked person on X, and he wants to make sure everyone's still looking at what he's tweeting. I think absolutely that's happening on X. That's happening on a lot of platforms where, but X in particular, where right-wing content and polarized content of all kinds continues to be the most popular and the most engaged with content. But X in particular, I think because of Elon, absolutely we're seeing that.
Censorship, is that part of the solution?
That's a great question.
Love that long pause. We like long pauses here. It means the guests have to think.
I think there's an element of, I'm hesitant to say censorship, but certainly of regulation. I don't think that censorship works. I think that limiting the ways in which people express their views ultimately will always end up backfiring. And I think that's a core part of sort of an American political identity. We very much believe in freedom of speech. And I think that and I think what we've seen is limiting the ability for people to post or talk about the things that they want largely has an impact of driving them further back into those beliefs. Because especially right now, I think a lot of people, if their post is censored, would go, oh, well, that only means that big tech is against me, or that there's some group of elites that don't want me to have this opinion. And I think that's an incredibly dangerous place to be.
But you can't say fire in a crowded theater. There
Correct.
are limits on free speech.
Correct. And I do think that there is smart regulation that we need to think about, because right now we still don't have a good regulatory regime around social media for things like dangerous speech. We're largely relying on the companies to do it themselves. And we're seeing that both on social media companies, but also on generative AI. You know, you saw Twitter, their generative AI model, Grok, has no guardrails around it, where places like ChatGPT and OpenAI invested quite a lot of money in bringing in experts to put safety guardrails and to understand how those tools can and should be used. But there are definitely nefarious actors, and we're only relying on the companies to do it themselves rather than getting smart about how we create regulations and create safety guardrails to make sure that people unknowingly aren't consuming vast amounts of untrue information.
Let's see if we can end this conversation on a reasonably upbeat note. If you think it's merited, it might not be merited. I can imagine, maybe not today, but at some point, a future where artificial intelligence combined with social media give users the power to really engage in direct democracy. I don't know if it's voting on bills or referenda or whatever it is, but it's a much deeper and better and faster, more immediate stake in their own democracy. Am I nuts to hope, to hold out for the possibility of that?
I don't think you're nuts to hold out that hope. And I think we saw a glimpse of this in the period on social media before the algorithms were there, when these social media platforms really were social networks. It was a way for us to connect with our friends very quickly and very rapidly online. And then now, as we've been talking about, these algorithms have had downstream effects. But one thing that I've been really excited about is this ability for new generations of people to come online and to organize and to build social movements that have been really optimistic and hopeful. You know, you look at disaster responses where people are going online and they're connecting with their community and they're using these platforms to do really great things. And they're right now, even in the political space, they can use these platforms to organize their friends and to get their voices out there. I have a lot of hope that we can continue to do that. I think that requires, as we were talking about, smart regulation and being able to protect users and citizens from the worst impacts of what these tech companies can do and what social media and AI can do more broadly. But I have a lot of hope that we can use these tools to organize and to communicate with our representatives and to build deeper trust and deeper relationships. But I think we're still at the very beginning of this new technology, and this isn't new. We had this exact conversation with the advent of radio. We had this exact conversation with the advent of television. We had this exact conversation in the 90s with the advent of the internet. With the beginnings of any new information technology, we're always going to have a period of time that's turbulent where we're wondering, is this the death of democracy? And I don't think it is. I think that we're in a period where we have to grapple with what it means, where we have to grapple with the new ways in which people are communicating and how we do that. But I do think we'll get to the other side. And like with radio, you know, radio brought us new ways of telling stories, new ways of getting people invested in the stories that matter in their lives. TV, as we're seeing here, helps bring stories into people's lives in even more tangible ways. But at the beginning, people didn't necessarily think of it like that. And I think that the same thing is happening with these social media companies and how we interact online. But we have to continue to ask these questions. It's an incredibly important role for the media. It's an incredibly important role for regulatory watchdogs and for civil society to continue asking these questions and to push us into that good direction, because it's not guaranteed. But I have a lot of hope that we're going to get there.
Amen. Corey Alpert, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Kingston's newest museum attraction, the SS Keewatin, is the sole surviving Edwardian-era passenger liner in the world. As part of the Canadian Pacific Railway fleet operating in the Upper Great Lakes in the early 1900s, it's fitting that she finally found her forever home in Canada's museum capital. Doug Cowie is the manager of the Great Lakes Museum in Kingston, which now owns the Keewatin.
The ship was built in Glasgow, Scotland, at the Fairfield Shipbuilding and Engineering Company. It came over under its own power.
Knowing the Keewatin would be too large to fit through the St. Lawrence Seaway canals and then later the Welland, bulkheads were designed into her hull so she could split into two pieces when she reached Montreal.
It was riveted together. They took out all the rivets. It was pulled apart, and then it was towed in two halves, or two sections, through the canal system, then put back together again in Buffalo.
In 1907, the Keewatin was put into service to transport passengers from Georgian Bay westward and return from Lake Superior with grains for export. After World War I, she was primarily used as a cruise ship. Dan Rose is the coordinator of collections and programs at the Great Lakes Museum.
Early on, passengers traveling on board the Keewatin were kind of a mishmash. Canadian Pacific was one of the first companies to try and sell Canada to Canadians by promoting Canadian tourism. They were encouraging folks to take their tour on the ship, pass through the beautiful natural scenery of the Great Lakes, and of course end up at one of Canadian Pacific's fine luxury hotels.
By the 1960s, trains, planes, and automobiles became the preferred method of travel, and steamships like the Keewatin were decommissioned and sold for scrap. The Keewatin's fate looked bleak. It would take no less than 3 miracles for her to find her way to Kingston, Ontario. The first one took the Keewatin to Douglas, Michigan.
This ship was basically in the scrapyard when this gentleman, this American from Michigan, bought it, took it down, and had it in his marina as a museum.
That American was R.J. Peterson, a community leader, history buff, and owner of Tower Marine. The Keewatin remained a feature of the Saugatuck Douglas community until 2012, when Peterson retired at 85. Once again, the Keewatin's future looked dire, until Skyline Investments purchased her and towed her back to Georgian Bay.
Then another miracle that it found another home. The ship was run by the Friends of Keewatin, and they did a great job of preserving the ship all those years until COVID came along in 2020. COVID shut the ship down.
When the pandemic eased, the labor required to reopen the ship was beyond the capabilities of the Friends group. Once again, the Keewatin's future was in doubt, and once again, she was acquired by a new owner, this time the Great Lakes Museum.
The museum acquired the ship in 2023 when it was donated by Skyline Investments. This is the third miracle that it arrived here.
But the journey to Kingston wasn't easy. Over 24 Friends of Keewatin volunteers worked 7 days a week for nearly 2 months to secure the ship and pack all its historical contents.
The ship was towed down to Hamilton, out of Georgian Bay, then out into Lake Huron, down through the St. Clair River, through the Detroit River, into Lake Erie, and then all the way through the Welland Canal and up to Hamilton.
By April of 2023, the Keewatin had been a museum exhibit for almost as long as she'd been a working vessel sailing the Great Lakes. Time had taken its toll, and she needed a lot of work.
We're at the Heddle Shipyard in Hamilton to have some major repairs done to it that we don't want to get involved in Kingston. Things such as sandblasting the tall funnel, the smokestack to some people. The 2 masts were also sandblasted and painted, along with all the davits that hold the lifeboats. We also had the wooden fur deck, which was 2.5 inches thick, completely removed because it was in pretty bad shape. It took like a crew of shipyard workers to work on it.
By the fall of 2023, the shipyard repairs were done and the Keewatin was ready for her final voyage to Kingston. A dedicated crew of volunteers eagerly awaited her arrival in Kingston, where months of labor were still required before the ship would be ready for public tours.
Almost 3.5 years of dust accumulated inside. And then you had a whole summer of activity in the shipyard of workers going up and down. And so it was a huge effort just to clean the ship at all deck levels. You can't make a project like this work without the volunteers. You can't hire people to do all the work that they're doing. A lot of volunteers over its history have really connected with this ship. The hours are unbelievable.
The final step before opening? Carefully unpacking all the ship's artifacts and putting everything back on display.
A core group of the Friends of Keewatin came down to help us stage the ship, which was another big operation that we had never done.
Today, visitors can choose between 2 40-minute guided walking tours.
They all have headsets on and the docent is speaking through a microphone so that everybody isn't straining to hear. It gives them some space to spread out and look into different cabins and so forth and wander around in little nooks and crannies.
The engine room experience is much more focused in the actual science and engineering of how a high-pressure steam ship was able to operate. In the early years of steam power experimentation, there was all manner of disasters that occurred. These boilers would often become so compressed and so sensitive that it's very easy for them to explode. So that tour was more focused on the science of this, whereas the passenger experience is focused on what life was like for those who were actually traveling on board.
The Keewatin was not as large or as grand as the Titanic, but the design of their engines, grand staircases, and dining parlors was the same, as was their adherence to the rigid class structures of the time.
This is an Edwardian ship by virtue of its elegant details, from the fine wood trim that you'll find throughout the vessel to even elements of the design of the ship itself. The smokestack, for example, is set at an angle to make it look as though it's going faster. Those of the serving class were meant to be seen when they were serving and then not seen otherwise. So believe it or not, the promenade was partially designed to allow crew to pass through different sections of the ship without being spotted by the passengers. The plates were actually heated in a warming drawer inside the kitchen. The tables would actually have been sprayed, the tablecloth specifically, by the waiters when the hot plates met with the tablecloth. The liquid tension would meet with the plate to actually secure it to the tablecloth so that it wouldn't slide around while the ship was in transit. It's special to know that you're on a ship that many traveled across in order to get to new homes and new beginnings.
More than 4,000 steamships were built during the Edwardian era. Of all those vessels, the SS Keewatin is the last.
It's crazy to think that there were ships that were larger, faster, more impressive, more historically significant. But despite it all, Keewatin is the only one that survived.
And that is the agenda for Monday, October 21st, 2024. Tomorrow, we'll hear from several Ontario city mayors on different, maybe tougher, approaches to the substance abuse crisis. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.